All right, guys, welcome in to the Interview Podcast, episode 23, the final one of the 2021-22 season, as we now have a Super Bowl champion. Hello, my name's Dick Lasilla, and as always, I'm joined by Leon Taryan and Conor Kennedy. And guys, it feels really weird, right? Because it was our first year doing this podcast, and just to reach the finish line, I mean, it's been a great time, and I'm pumped to talk about this last game of the year.
Oh, yeah. Like, definitely one of the best ways that you can cap off the longest and most chaotic NFL season that we've experienced so far. A little boring at times, but, a good defensive matchup and the team that, was billed as the Super Bowl contender early on. Last year they traded for Matt Stafford, brought in OBJ, brought in Von Miller, said F them picks. They made good on their promise, and they ended up winning in their own stadium. Congratulations to the LA Rams, and that was something. Also, congrats to the Bengals too for making it as far as they did.
Yeah, 2 years in a row where their team wins at home. It's unbelievable. And Matthew Stafford was happy. A lot of players were happy. Tears of joy from several players. All around a fun Super Bowl. I enjoyed it a lot.
Absolutely. So let's dive right into it. Of course, here in the True Podcast, we break down all of the games week to week. But of course, this week there's only 1-2 breakdown. So we're going to spend a lot of time here talking about the Super Bowl 56 in Los Angeles. Kind of a tale of two different teams, right? Because the Los Angeles Rams had a lot of expectations coming to this game. They traded for Matthew Stafford in the offseason and just had a star-studded lineup. You had Odell Beckham, Aaron Donald, Cooper Kupp, Von Miller, Jalen Ramsey. The list goes on and on of the talent that was on this Rams team. They're Hollywood. They play in this fancy stadium. And they had all the celebrities decked out in blue and gold, ready to be coronated on their home home field. But here comes in Cinderella from the Buckeye State, from Cincinnati, led by Joe Burrow in his second year ever, the first quarterback to be drafted number one and to lead his team to the Super Bowl within his first 2 years, leading a franchise that hadn't even won a playoff game in 33 years up until a couple of weeks ago. And it was, I was sitting there thinking this is based literally a David v. Goliath matchup. And we got a very evenly matched game throughout the course of 4 quarters. Both teams threw a lot of punches at each other. Of course, just kind of a general recap. The Rams jumped out to a 14-3 lead in this game. Matthew Stafford was on fire early. Both Odell Beckham and Cooper Kupp got touchdowns. However, what happened from there is the Bengals were able to come back, score a touchdown of their own with a Joe Mixon to T. Higgins touchdown pass. Not a Joe Burrow touchdown pass, but a Joe Mixon touchdown pass. And really the turning point early on for where this game was going to go was when Odell Beckham on a 3rd and 9 tore his ACL, removing the secondary threat for the Rams passing game. And this is a Rams passing attack that was missing their top tight ends. And virtually it was just Cooper Kupp and Matthew Stafford versus what was a very hard playing and a well playing Cincinnati Bengals defense. And so they go into halftime up 13-10. And that's another factor too, is that on the second touchdown from Matthew Stafford to Cooper Kupp, the Rams bobbled the snap, so they didn't get the extra point there. And of course, after what I thought was just an incredible halftime show by Dr. Dre, Snoop Dogg, Kendrick Lamar, Mary J. Blige, and Eminem, and 50 Cent, the Bengals come out and hit a dime from Joe Burrow to T. Higgins for his second touchdown catch of the day. They go up 17-13. And then immediately right after that, on the first play of the next drive, the Bengals get an interception. So it's like, oh my goodness, the Bengals are about to blow this game wide open. But the Rams, and probably the most critical stop of the day, were able to hold them to 20-13. And then from there, it was a defensive slugfest. Both teams' defensive lines really took over this game, especially the Rams. The Rams ended up with 7 sacks in this game. And just back and forth. The Rams were able to get a field goal. But in the last minutes of this game, Matthew Stafford and Cooper Kupp willed their way down the field. I mean, literally, the whole world knew that Cooper Kupp was going to get the ball multiple times, and he couldn't be stopped. And, and obviously there's some controversial calls towards the end when they were inside the 10-yard line. We'll definitely talk way more about that. But the end result is that Matthew Stafford was able to find Cooper Kupp for the go-ahead touchdown with under 2 minutes left. But the Bengals did have time, and they were moving the ball well. They got down to midfield, and they had a 2nd and 1 from over midfield. But they failed to gain anything on 3 straight plays, and the game was over, as Aaron Donald pointed to the sky and pointed to his ring finger, saying, "Ring me," as the Rams won 23-20 on their home turf, the 2nd straight team to win on their home turf after 54 years. Have a team never won at their home stadium. No, it's happened twice in a row. It's pretty insane, a pretty insane stat. So just what is your general reaction to how this game unfolded? Because it kind of, in a way, kind of went the way I thought it would, but in a way I thought it might have been a little more defensive. I think the Odell injury really had a major influence in how this game went. But at the same time, the ultimate factor, I think, was what we were talking about all week. The Rams defensive line just overwhelmed the Bengals, especially in that second half.
Like I said earlier, Nick, this game was a defensive slugfest, and that was on full display, I think, the entire game. It was pretty boring offensively until that Odell touchdown in the first quarter, I think. And, the Cincinnati defense, they held up pretty well. Not as much as the Rams defense, of course, but they came in hot with 2 sacks, 9 tackles for loss. But that Rams defense, man, I know it was a whole storyline, these past couple weeks, that Rams D-line versus the Cincy O-line, which has been a point of concern with the Bengals over the past couple years. And that was on full display this past Sunday, especially with Aaron Donald and late season addition Von Miller really contributing, both of them 2 sacks each. Aaron Donald with 2 tackles for loss and 3 QB hits. And of course, one of the reasons why Aaron Donald was a candidate for Super Bowl MVP was his incredible 4th down stop where he brought down Joe Burrow and effectively ended the Bengals' chances of winning and gave him his first Super Bowl ring. If Cooper Kupp didn't win, I think it should have been Aaron Donald, because he showed on the field why he's one of the greatest defensive players of all time in the NFL, at least in my opinion. But also offensively, there's some exciting things that happened too. I mean, obviously Matt Stafford threw 3 touchdowns, one of them to OBJ, who also could have been a candidate for MVP if he didn't get injured during the game, sadly. But also Cooper Kupp, man, 8 receptions, 92 yards, 2 touchdowns, including the game-winning touchdown. He also tried to throw a touchdown pass to Matt Stafford, which, in my head, I predicted it because, we've been talking all year about the Matt Stafford and Cooper Kupp connection. Why don't you reverse it for the biggest game of the year? Of course, that did not work out too well. And honestly, another key point about this was there wasn't much of a run game to talk about. The Bengals tried to establish one with Joe Mixon. And it wasn't that bad. 15 carries, 72 yards for almost 5 yards a carry. But beyond that, most of the time, both of these teams tried to run the ball. They wouldn't gain too much traction. And I think it was somewhat to the detriment of the Bengals. Even though Joe Mixon performed relatively well, I think in some of the drives, especially the last one, they just tried to run the ball too much and kind of forgot that they had that superstar quarterback in Joe Burrow and one of the best wide receiver tandems in the league. And that definitely hurt them, because when they needed that extra yard or two, at least like one of those 3 times, the offensive line would probably be able to hold up to enough for at least Joe Burrow to dump it off for an easy gain. But, again, like I said, they relied too much on the run game. And of course, that's really important in football, as we all know, keeps the defense honest. But if you try to run it up the gut too much, it's ineffective. It's not too productive.
I think going into this game, it was not as hyped as much as last year's Brady and Mahomes matchup. I didn't really see too much going on social media and a lot of TV ads compared to last year. But that second half, that started off great, but I think it was a bit controversial for calls on both sides. T. Higgins clearly pushed away Jalen Ramsey's face mask on the 75-yard opening drive touchdown the second half, and then the Rams' last score that they got to Cooper Kupp for his second touchdown, Logan Wilson got a defensive holding call on I forgot who, on somebody running a crossing route, but it didn't really look like enough to me. So I thought those were two blown calls. And I brought up in the last podcast, I was wrong about the Bengals not scoring any touchdowns, but Aaron Donald came up big. He proved why he is probably the most valuable player in the NFL. He didn't get the 3 sacks that I said that he would, but he got 2 of those, and he made the most important play of the game. So I guess it goes back to that statement of defense wins championships, and it looked like it was a true statement on this last drive.
Yeah, to me, because you remember very early on in the third quarter, Aaron Donald, there was a play on the sideline, and he really hadn't done much up to that point. And he got into a little scuffle. And from that moment on, after the little scuffle, Donald was a man on a mission. He could not be stopped. He completely changed the course of the game. And on every play, I know he technically just got 2 sacks, but his impact's way beyond just the 2 sacks. He put Joe Burrow under an extreme amount of duress. It really opened up room for guys like Von Miller to really get after the quarterback, like a guy like Leonard Floyd to get after the quarterback. You know, it's just really impressive to really think about what they were able to do. And really, I really also think we should give a shout out to this Rams secondary. I know Jalen Ramsey got kind of burnt a couple of times, but as you said on the T. Higgins touchdown, that should have been offensive pass interference. Like, T. Higgins clearly ripped his face mask. That should have been called back. And they did an otherwise pretty good job keeping the rest of these receivers in check. You know, Jamar Chase had 5 catches for 89 yards, a decent stat line, but he didn't just burn them, a ton, and was really able to keep them in line. I think, too, also when you take a look at the stat sheet here, Tyler Boyd only had 5 catches for 48 yards. They prevented him from doing a ton of damage. T. Higgins obviously had his 2 TDs, but didn't do a lot of damage outside of those 2 touchdowns. And I think the one thing here that's really impressive to me is the Rams were still able to win despite 2 turnovers, despite having the 2 interceptions. The Bengals didn't turn over the ball in this game. And I said that was one of the key factors. That's how the Bengals got to this position. The Titans turned it over 3 times. The Chiefs turned it over 3 times. And the Bengals were taking good care of the football. And they still did in this game. But, in a way, even though they didn't have any technical turnovers, some of that 4th down early on, not getting that was certainly I wouldn't say a mistake, because I liked them going for it in that situation, but that decision comes with risk, and they paid the price for it. And that was very key points early on that they gave up. And, they just weren't able to overcome, because they clearly were the underdogs here. They had a talent differential, and especially on that offensive line, giving up 7 sacks. But that defense certainly kept them in that game. And they needed one more drive, and they just were not able to get it throughout the course of the game. And really, it's just, the Rams had Aaron Donald, and the Bengals did not. And that kind of segues into the next thing I want to talk about here, because Cooper Kupp won the MVP, which is the first time the receiver has won the Triple Crown in the season, which is most catches, most yards, and most touchdowns, and Super Bowl MVP in the same season. Not even Jerry Rice was able to do that back when he won it. Back, I believe, was 1988 is when they did that. It's when he was able to accomplish that MVP. But a lot of people are arguing that Aaron Donald should have won MVP just because of his impact, even though it technically doesn't really have the stats for it. And it's one of those subjective things, especially when it comes to defense, because, does 3 sacks get him the reward instead of just 2? But when it comes to a nose tackle, your impact often doesn't reflect in the stat sheets. What do you all think about that? Do you think Cooper Kupp deserved the award? Because part of me can see why he got it, because especially when Odell went down, he was their only big time receiving threat and really was able to carry the team on his back on that last drive. But I think Aaron Donald was the one who gave him that scenario in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, Cooper Kupp definitely showed up in this game. Not his best performance considering how amazingly he played in the regular season. But certainly he was a main contributor. I mean, of course, like I said earlier, he was the guy who caught the game-winning touchdown for the Rams. But if Aaron Donald doesn't come in on that 4th down stop on the Bengals' last offensive drive, I think Jamar Chase catches that pass from Joe Burrow. And I think that the Bengals at least kick a field goal, if not score the game-winning touchdown. So Aaron Donald, he was definitely a game wrecker. He saw how weak that Bengals offensive line was, and he got to the quarterback. And he did multiple times of the game, got the game-winning stop. I think he was the main reason why, arguably the main reason why the Los Angeles Rams ended up coming out with the dub.
I mean, we might be looking at the best defensive tackle of all time. Definitely the greatest defensive player I've seen in my life so far. And he's not really built like a defensive tackle. That's the scary part. He's so athletic, but he could bull rush you just like he did to the Bengals offensive line, get past you. Every year he's in the conversation to win Defensive Player of the Year. I think he had 9 straight Pro Bowls ever since his rookie season. The guy is unbelievable. And I think if you had any other defensive tackle there, Jamar Chase would have had a touchdown. So he's deserving of MVP. Cooper Kupp is. You can make that argument. Matt Stafford is, based on how he played. The whole team is just unbelievably stacked. And the big question I have is, do they even get better in the offseason with free agency? What do they do with Andrew Whitworth probably retiring? Eric Weddle's probably going to said he's going to re-retire. What do you do to sort of fix up those holes? Because I'm assuming, I haven't taken a look at the cap yet, but I'm assuming it's getting close to that or even over going into free agency based on all the talent they have on both sides of the ball.
Well, the thing about that is there's a rumor that Aaron Donald himself might retire. Even though he's only 8 seasons to a career, kind of similar to Luke Kuechly, in terms of, he's still, he wants to preserve his body. He wants to be there for his children moving forward. And let's be honest, at this point, he's accomplished everything. He's gone to the Pro Bowl so many times. He's won a Super Bowl. He's the 3-time Defensive Player of the Year. He has really nothing else to accomplish at this point. And now it's just all about willpower. Like, do you still want to go through the grind? And we're going to really find out here in the next couple of weeks. But, I don't blame him if he wants to walk out now on top. Because it is a storybook ending if he does. And there is so much on the line, especially for a nose tackle who's constantly hitting the line. And speaking on whether or not he's the best player of all time, or at least best defensive player, seen a lot of talk about him or Lawrence Taylor. Now, obviously, none of us got to see Lawrence Taylor play because that was before our time. And, obviously, I was going back and watching some Lawrence Taylor highlights today. And obviously, that guy was an absolute monster. Like, guys could not block him back then. And he got to the quarterback whenever he wanted to. Back in the 80s and early 90s for the Giants. So, to me, he is a different type of player. He was more of an outside linebacker. So it's just a different style position, and it has different responsibilities from a nose tackle. So I feel like those positions are incomparable. Like, you can't compare like an Ed Reed to Aaron Donald just because they do wildly different things. And that's because this is why, like, think about the NBA, for example. It's a lot easier to me to compare like LeBron to Michael Jordan than it is to compare like Aaron Donald to Tom Brady or Aaron Donald to any other defensive player, just because the roles and responsibilities of each player are so different. So I think he might be the best defensive player of this era. But I just think because of the way offenses have evolved over time, it might be impossible to say for certainty this guy was the best defensive player ever.
I was saying more like position at D tackle, because he's changed the game, and you always have to respect how one player can really change the position. He's a lot slimmer compared to most D tackles. He looks
Right.
more like a D end, and he even lined up at D end against Trent Williams, who was hurt on the 49ers in the conference championship game, and used that towards his advantage to get pressure on Jimmy G.
Yeah. So I was looking at Spot Track, about some of the things going on with the Bengals in terms of the cap. Right now they're slightly over 10 mil over the cap. And of course, Andrew Whitworth, I think, will probably retire after this year. We'll see about Aaron Donald. If Andrew Whitworth retires, I think they'll have about 5 million. But then they'll also have to worry about re-signing Odell Beckham Jr., who presumably is not going to re-sign unless they pay him a lot more than what they paid him for his current contract, which I think is
Right.
$750,000 before
And do you
incentives.
know how much that he took home in that pay? Because like my friends and I were talking about this, $35,000 he took home in net earnings this year from that
Oh,
contract.
geez. Yeah. I know it was there were like 3 million in base incentives, which I think he hit all of those, but of course, a lot of that's probably gone after LA taxes and whatnot, considering what you said about him taking away only 35 grand. And they also got to worry about Von Miller too. His trade was kind of just like a rental period. I think he's going to re-sign with the Rams. He expressed that in an interview a while back during this postseason, but I think that'll be a somewhat significant chunk of change. Of course, he's not the same player that he was the last time he was in the Super Bowl when he won Super Bowl MVP with the Broncos. But he's still definitely a productive player, like we talked about earlier. So they're going to have to worry about re-signing those two free agents. They also got to worry perhaps about a new contract with Matt Stafford. Who knows if he's still in the league after his contract expires after next season. And of course, they'll probably need to pay a pretty penny to Cooper Kupp after his legendary season, and bringing in free agents and whatnot. Jalen Ramsey, for example. So it's definitely going to be difficult for the Rams. I mean, I think it was worth it personally. I think we'd all agree, considering they won a Super Bowl and they went all in. But it's going to be tough, at least after these next couple of years. Personally, from what I see of the roster right now, and how much it's going to cost to really bring all those guys back and run it back, I'm not entirely sure that I have as much confidence that I had this past postseason at them really making a run and winning a Super Bowl. I think they'll probably be, they'll definitely be in the postseason next season, at least from what I can tell. But it's going to be definitely hard for them to win another ring, at least over these next couple years.
I agree, because I feel like they have 1 to 2 more chances tops before all of the trades really, start to rear their ugly head, because they don't have a first round pick until 2024. And we know with Sean McVay, they might continue to trade those away, because clearly they don't feel like they need to draft. And of course, obviously, this is really the first time I feel like we've really seen a team do something like this. This feels like more like an NBA type move, where you're trading away all your picks to go all in. And I think what's going to be interesting to see is how many other teams attempt this. And honestly, one team that I really think should do it is my Titans. I think we have so many good pieces right now that I think would be crazy not to attempt a similar style of going all in. You'll get all the pieces you can. You'll upgrade your quarterback, upgrade the positions that let us down this year, especially against the Bengals. So I think this may start a new era of team building, because if you have remotely any chance of winning the Super Bowl, it's going to honestly turn more to NBA or like MLB, where you are doing whatever it takes to trade your way into a championship. That's kind of how it worked for the Atlanta Braves last year in the MLB. They made so many insane trades, like a trade of Jock Peterson, for example, that really paid off for them in October. And now we've seen how it worked out for the Rams. So it's going to be interesting that we might be entering a new era of team building in the NFL.
Yeah, that's something that I was thinking about quite a bit too, and especially considering that the Bucks, while they already had kind of that base before they brought in Brady and Gronk and AB and all their star players from that 2020 run, of course they had Chris Godwin, Mike Evans already there, as well as Jason Pierre-Paul and Ndamukong Suh, and some of their pieces from the draft as well. They still brought in some guys and really went all in for Brady in order to bring back a ring to Tampa Bay for the first time since John Gruden did it in, I think, 2003. I'm going to vouch for my team, the Buffalo Bills. I really hope they do some super team stuff. This past offseason, we went to the AFC Championship game last year, but Brandon Beane was somewhat conservative in terms of his free agent signings. I think the biggest signing was probably Emmanuel Sanders, and that's just because of how the cap was, and then they kind of depended on some of the rookies to really produce, at least on the defensive front, their first year. Obviously, that didn't necessarily work out to plan in terms of them going to a Super Bowl, but hopefully he sees what the Bengals did in bringing in Trey Hendrickson and also the Rams bringing in Von Miller, and he can bring in like a free agent defensive end that can really apply pressure for the quarterback and really hit home, which is something that I haven't seen with the Bills, at least for a couple years. I know the cap is what it is, but you can kick the can for a couple years if you really want to go for a Super Bowl run, and making some important trades like the Rams have done for sure. Man, I can just dream about this all day, honestly.
But it happens where super teams lose. I think Aaron Rodgers, I think Green Bay was all in for him this year personally. This is the best team he's ever had, in my opinion, even better than the Super Bowl he won more than a decade ago. I firmly believe that. And they lost at home where they should have won, in which, in my opinion, in Lambeau or Arrowhead, you have the best home field advantage in the NFL. Maybe in Buffalo or in New England also, but definitely in Green Bay. But if Aaron Rodgers goes to Tennessee or Aaron Rodgers goes to Denver, even if you build a super team, is that enough to get that guy in the Super Bowl based on his playoff record? It's a big question because he's the best passer in NFL history, in my opinion. 2 back-to-back MVP seasons. If he goes somewhere, can he make it to the big game? Because he'll make it to the playoffs. He could be a 1-seed player. He could get his 5th MVP next year in Ty Manning. But there's so much of what could happen in the regular season. Does that really apply towards the playoffs? That's honestly the biggest question I have this offseason, and where Devontae Adams will go. That's how I really feel about it.
Yeah, and it's so tricky too because the playoffs in the NFL are one and done. It's not like the NBA or MLB where you get a 7-game series, or 5 games in the first round for the MLB. But I digress. Doesn't all come down to one day in those sports. Here, when you build a super team, it's going to come down to one day. And you better hope your super team is ready for that one day, or you're going to end up like the Packers with a pie in your face, like we saw a couple of weeks ago against the 49ers. So a lot of franchises are going to be, I feel like are going to really be sitting back. Like I think like a John Robinson, for example, GM of the Titans, going to be sitting back this offseason and thinking, okay, can I afford to continue building the way I've been building and expect to truly have a shot at a title? Or am I going to have to do what the Rams just did? Or like the Bills, or am I going to have to do that? The Chiefs, how much time are you going to have Mahomes, Tyreek Hill, and Travis Kelce together? How do you continue to put them in positions to win? There is so many factors that go into this because as we saw with the Bucks, Brady leaving, it can all be over just like that. And sometimes you got to go for the Super Bowl when it's there. So it's a really fascinating thing to think about because NFL teams, I feel like, have never really done this until now. And, maybe Brady has kind of ushered in this new era when he went to Tampa of building up these teams, these super teams, with the sole goal of winning a championship, and which feels so much harder to do because, as you said, Connor, you have to have that base. You can't really create a team out of thin air. You know, what I think about like the Brooklyn Nets, for example, a couple of years ago, they just traded away Harden, but they didn't really have much of anything until they brought in the big three of Katie, of Harden, and of Kyrie Irving. But you can't really do that in football. You got to have the foundation first. So I still think that I still think we can have a healthy balance, because I don't want a situation where it's just the super teams that are able to win. Because the Bengals certainly won a super team, and they were a possession away, less than half a field away from winning the Super Bowl. So it's a healthy balance of where just because you have the super team doesn't mean you're automatically going to win, like we have seen in some of these other sports. But it certainly does increase your opportunity to win if you have the super team.
Yeah,
the problem. No, go ahead, Connor.
Sorry, I'll just do a little quick piece. Something that just came up to me while we were talking about this is that there's been a couple teams that have tried to create super teams within the NFL, and it hasn't necessarily worked to their favor. I mean, look at the New Orleans Saints. The last 2 to 3 years that Drew Brees was there, they were really all in on trying to get him a second championship. You know, bringing in a lot of defensive players, spending a lot of free agency, making trades, whatnot. And the closest they ever got was the no-call game with the Rams in the NFC Championship game 3 years ago, I think. And now Brees is gone, and, you know, they don't have a quarterback. They barely have any weapons besides Kamara, who, I mean, he'll probably be back, but who knows? I'm not going to speculate on that. And their defense is still pretty good. But as we've seen these past couple of years, a lot of free guys have been cut. A lot of people have just left in free agency, and the Saints are definitely a much different team than they were a couple of years ago. And another example that I can talk about is the Kansas City Chiefs. This past offseason, they saw that the O-line was a particular problem, especially within the Super Bowl playing the Bucs. So they spent a lot in free agency, brought in Joe Thuney, a couple other guys for the line, traded for Orlando Brown Jr., and restructured a lot of contracts, including Kelsey and Mahomes. Of course, they did not succeed in winning a Super Bowl. They lost in the AFC Championship game. And now some of that cap that they kicked is starting to bite them in the butt. I think, you know, Mahomes is due for over $20 million this year alone. And, you know, it doesn't always work out when you're trying to, you know, really hit home and win big by, you know, basically winning the offseason and bringing in all these guys to try and win.
But the problem with creating a super team is when players have disagreements over contracts, when this guy wants this amount more. It's not like Tom Brady, who's already created his own supplement company and decides to take pay cuts with the Bucs. If Tom Brady wanted $100 million with the Buccaneers, which I think he is worth, they probably wouldn't give it to him. They probably couldn't even afford it, because that would definitely go over the cap. I haven't looked at it yet previously, but with a reasonable assumption. So if you look at a team that's over the cap, like the Green Bay Packers, they can't afford to bring in more guys to make that team better. It's not going to happen. They're probably going to go through an entire rebuild this season. So how do you get all those guys on super teams to agree with one another and to take pay cuts, especially since they think that they're bringing the value, which some of these players are. Some of these players are well worth their contracts. And how do you balance that out? Because that could definitely spark a lot of issues amongst teammates, I'd say, over contracts. There could definitely be jealousy, other issues in the locker room. So that's always the biggest challenge in itself.
Yeah, it runs you to a lot of the debate on NIL in college, because you have some guys, like, for example, at Alabama, Bryce Young, Heisman winner, got $1 million in NIL money this year. There's guys in that locker room who got nothing. So So jealousy certainly is happening at all levels of football. But I think one of the things that really helped the Rams this year is they're able to find guys who really were more worried about their legacy than the money. Like, you think about like a guy like Odell, right? Has a lot of money in endorsements and stuff like that, but he was starting to be kind of seen as an afterthought, especially this year with all the drama in Cleveland. And he really needed the Rams to kind of help resuscitate his career. And now he's going to be able to demand more money moving forward, assuming he's going to be able to be healthy after his ACL injury. Same goes for Von Miller. Von Miller hadn't been playing as well in Denver the past couple of seasons, and he wasn't going to get top tier money, but he's been able to be resuscitated in LA. Eric Weddle, you know, wasn't even playing, but he really wanted that ring. So he came back and played for the Rams at a smaller piece. I feel like when Tom Brady went to the Bucks, obviously he had all the money in the world, but um, he decided that he wanted to prove that he wanted to win another ring without Bill Belichick. So he took the cut that was necessary to bring other good players with him. I think you got to find guys who are willing to take that pay cut because not everyone's willing to. Like someone like Aaron Rodgers, I don't think is going to be able to. Let's just be honest. He's going to want his money, what he's worth. And it's going to make it really hard to build a team around a guy like that because you need the space because you don't have unlimited space like you kind of do in these other sports. And really, it's just circumstances that I think really help the Rams, and most teams are not going to be able to replicate that unless you get the perfect pieces to fall into place. And you can think about just even getting Matthew Stafford was a perfect situation. You were able to, you had this quarterback that you didn't like, but was good enough to entice a rebuilding team to get rid of their franchise quarterback who wasn't happy there anymore. Just so many things had to go perfectly to get this team in this position. And I think that's one thing that other teams have to also consider if whether or not they want to pursue this route, because it's going to be really hard to replicate the exact and it's like a science experiment. Sometimes it works perfectly, but it's because of certain things came together for it to work perfectly. It's not going to always occur like that. So it's definitely going to be something to watch in the off season. We're definitely going to talk about a lot in the throughout this offseason. I'm curious to see how it affects the draft. I'm curious to see if it'll affect more draft trades and all of that. But kind of one last topic on the Super Bowl itself I want to talk about that's been getting a lot of debate is officiating. And that's been an off and on topic throughout the season. One thing that trended after the game last night is NFL rigged. A lot of people thought that the NFL rigged the game for the Rams. And as I've stated earlier, I don't think they did because there was calls that were missed on the Bengals earlier on in the game. And it's just poor officiating, especially in the Super Bowl, especially with all the technology that we have. I just don't understand how we're allowing referees to miss calls because we should be able to get these with virtual 100% accuracy because we can see every little thing on the field. I personally don't think they really affected the outcome too much. Like, I think the Rams would have won regardless because if they were doing their jobs, the Bengals would not have gotten that touchdown right after halftime. And I think the Rams probably keep the lead the entire time. And, what are your thoughts on the whole officiating controversy?
I mean, this has been a point of contention among fans, among, beat writers and media people in the league for pretty much the whole season. I mean, you talk about the first couple weeks, taunting was a big problem, especially one example that I can bring up, I'll bring up two. One, the Bears Steelers Monday Night Football game where 59 on the defense for the Bears accidentally bumps into that one ref, and then he throws a flag for taunting, which, honestly, that could have affected his career a bit considering he was, I think, upgraded from the practice squad for that game. So he probably wasn't getting too many chances to play, significant minutes after that penalty. And then in the divisional round, the Bills and Chiefs, the Tyreek Hill peace sign, which is one of the reasons why the taunting penalty was talked about and, really encouraged to, be thrown so much this season. He throws the peace sign against the Bills defense and that doesn't get thrown, but he gets a fine after the game. And a lot of, missed calls in terms of holding and, pass interference and whatnot. Especially with that T. Higgins call that, Leon talked about earlier too. I just wish that there was a way that the NFL could, objectively look at this and be like, there's a problem. We need to, create a program that can train all of these referees to, not miss these calls as well as, not call BS and, penalties that aren't there. Especially considering how hard it is to become a ref in the NFL. They just cannot miss these calls, but when they do it can really throw games sometimes.
I was genuinely surprised with how fast the game went too. I did not see. I think it was only 2 or 3 flags in that game. There should have been more, but compared to other Super Bowls, I've never seen a game go by this past: first quarter, second quarter, halftime show, third quarter, fourth quarter. You have to do a better job of it, because even that Bengals Raiders game that we all watched in the wild card round, would that have been a touchdown if the officiating staff didn't blow the whistle before Burrow goes out of bounds? It's the missed calls. It creates a lot of anger amongst the fans, and we deserve the best game possible, the most fair game that we could possibly see played. So I think the Rams still would have won, but the Bengals, I don't think even would have scored after halftime, to be honest. If that T. Higgins call was made, then it would have been different. But I think the Rams would have probably had one last touchdown also with the whole Logan Wilson thing. So it definitely should have been a lower scoring game, in my opinion.
Right. It's inexcusable. It's just weird to me because they called the game so hands off for 58 minutes, and then they start throwing the flag for everything right at the end. And I'm just like, okay, why are you calling stuff now that you didn't call the rest of the game? Is it just because it's the end? No, like if you set, all right, you either decide you're going to call the game tight or call the game loose. I'm fine with either, but stick to the style of the game you're going to call. Like, don't change up how you're going to call the game right at the end just because it's the end. I understand it's the Super Bowl. I'm sure they were probably nervous. They probably got the hand on their flag like it's a gun, like ready to throw at any moment. But you got to hold your discipline, like just because it's the last 2 minutes of the Super Bowl doesn't mean it's any different for the referees. You call those plays like you call, the first quarter of the first week in September. And I feel like that was part of what happened there at the end. And that's what makes it so frustrating, because it feels like they felt like we have to insert ourselves in the biggest possession of the year. And you just really didn't have to. I will say the Taunton penalty after the first touchdown was probably deserved, just because you can't have people running off the sideline onto the field of play. Like, that was a pretty silly penalty for Cincinnati to have in that moment. Like, you got to be able to control your sideline in that moment. But, just probably other smaller penalties that were missed throughout the game. But it was just frustrating to see it kind of come down to that, and for people to feel like that's how this ended. Because I feel like there's a lot of, the NFL wanted LA to win because it was in LA. They're the more wealthy franchise, and there's all kinds of factors into it. But I always feel like there's always going to be an element to that, regardless of result, just because whoever loses is going to look for reasons why they lost. And sometimes officiating does have a part in that. So, is there any last comments that either of you have on the Super Bowl before we move on to a general retrospective? All right. So, how we kind of want to finish this episode off is just kind of recapping the season as a whole. It's the first 18-week regular season, and we've had extended playoffs, and so much has happened. Like the week 1, that first game between the Cowboys and the Buccaneers back in September feels like a long, long, long time ago. Feels like a millennia to me. And it's just so many storylines, so many narratives, so much happened. When you look back at the 2021 season, are you going to remember moving forward?
That records were shattered. What could have been is something that I think of with Derrick Henry. Obviously, I'll think about probably the most difficult season being a Giants fan, even though we've had more wins than some of our previous seasons. But I can't help but be more excited for free agency and the NFL draft, because we already saw what 18 games is like. We already saw what a great NFL season this was in the postseason. I can't help but really think how fun this draft is going to be, because there are so many defensive prospects in the first round, a plethora of offensive line talent, a couple of receivers, a few quarterbacks in the first round. That'll be interesting with Aaron Rodgers, Devontae Adams, other free agents. There's just so much that we're going to see, and how can these 18 regular season games next season be improved?
The one thing that all remember from the season is all the storylines. involving all these different teams. I mean, the Rams going all in and being that Super Bowl contender, the Cincinnati Bengals being that dark horse contender that, a lot of people might have thought would have finished third or fourth within the AFC North, but they end up winning the division and going to the Super Bowl. The Kansas City Chiefs, who also went all in considering their offensive line, and they were talking up, 20-0 and whatnot. Obviously, that did not happen. Just the whole fiasco involving OBJ as well, and the drama in Cleveland, and then him going to LA and kind of revitalizing his career, and just some of the disappointments as well. I mean, the Cleveland Browns and the Baltimore Ravens not making the playoffs. The Seattle Seahawks kind of falling apart and Russell Wilson being injured. The San Francisco 49ers going on a run as well, being a scary team to face in the postseason. And also the Green Bay Packers, with that whole Aaron Rodgers offseason drama, but he comes back. They bring back Randall Cobb. Rodgers and Tay are building this to the last dance. And then, of course, they choke in the postseason. But, just all of these different narratives about teams. And, the Bucs also trying to run it back, bringing back all their starters from the Super Bowl the previous year. Just looking at how these teams were viewed at the beginning of the season and then seeing where everything ended up, it's, really interesting to me.
Yeah, don't forget the MVP candidate, Mike White.
Yeah, Mike White. Yeah.
Legend himself, probably the best game in Jets-Giants history in the past maybe decade of the regular season, in my opinion.
Hey, beat the runner-ups, too, of the entire league, which is insane to think about. The Jets, they beat the Bengals, they beat the Titans. They may have not had many wins, but all their wins were good ones. So
I think they broke the record because it said, I was reading something, Zach Wilson, Elijah Moore, and Michael Carter all had 14 touchdowns amongst each other, and I think that's a rookie record. Something I read. So there's potential there, but I want to see the Big Blue make an improvement this offseason.
Yeah. When I think about this particular season, of course, just from a personal note, I remember going to my first ever NFL games. I had never been to one before. This year went to Dolphins Titans a couple of weeks ago. And so just seeing these athletes in person, it's just such a different experience on TV. And I'm looking forward to going to many more. And obviously just for the Titans, yes, it ended in a very heartbreaking fashion, but the resiliency of this team is something that I'll never forget. Obviously Mike Vrabel has a great culture going, winning Coach of the Year this year. And, losing your star player, going through 91 players throughout the season, I hope to God they make the right moves moving forward to put themselves in a position to win the Super Bowl, because they blew out the Super Bowl champions in their own house back in November. So it certainly was potentially an opportunity missed for them. But just as a whole, I'll remember some of the funny stuff. I remember stuff like Urban Meyer in Jacksonville, that whole saga. I'll remember, obviously, the last ride of Ben Roethlisberger, the last ride of Tom Brady, the rise of Joe Burrow. Obviously, some of these other rookies, what Mac Jones was able to do with the Patriots, how that team kind of came going. Obviously, Jonathan Taylor and the amazing performances that he had in the second half of the year before the Colts completely collapsed and Carson Wentz, ruined their whole season. The Raiders, I think outside the Titans, the Raiders, that team and their resiliency after everything that happened with John Gruden and Henry Ruggs, and how they were able to fight through all of that to get to the playoffs. And that amazing Week 18 game between them and the Chargers, probably one of the greatest games ever, at least in terms of the regular season and getting into the playoffs. That divisional round weekend, just how every game came down to the line. So many just incredible games. And you never really knew how it was ever going to end because it was so chaotic. Any team could beat anyone on any given week, truly any given Sunday. And for the Cincinnati Bengals of all teams to make the Super Bowl, it's just insane. And it should give, I think, every team hope. If you're a Detroit Lions fan, for example, that should give you a little more hope. If you're a Cleveland Browns fan, that should give you a little more hope. Trying to think of it, like Arizona Cardinals, Jacksonville Jaguars, Houston Texans. Any of these teams that might have never really done anything. Anyone can do anything in this league. We saw what Cincinnati was able to do, and it just has me really excited for next year, because if this season was this unpredictable, then who knows going forward, because it feels like this year closed one chapter and opened up another, because we're now in a brand new era of the NFL where it's no longer the Brady's and Roethlisbergers running the league, but it's Mahomes, Allen, Burrow, Jackson, Herbert, and everyone else who will be fighting it out for AFC titles and for Super Bowls moving forward. And we'll definitely look back at this year as the transition year, as really a year where the NFL got itself back on its feet, because obviously last year was a really tough year with upon the pandemic restrictions, and we didn't have full crowds last year, and just getting back to being in front of full crowds again, that just made this year so much more special. I was thinking about that yesterday watching the Super Bowl, because last year, it was in front of, I think, 20,000 people in Tampa. It didn't feel like the Super Bowl, but yesterday it did. And I think because of what we had 2 years ago, it will definitely make each season moving forward more appreciative. It'll make me more appreciative of what the season brings. One question I wanted to ask, just after all the football that we've seen this year, do you think there's any specific rule change that you would like to see implemented by the NFL this offseason?
I'd say perhaps removing the taunting penalty, honestly, because I think it just takes the emotion out of the game. And football is naturally an emotional game. I mean, it's a physical game. Guys are hitting each other as hard as they possibly can. They're going to try to hype their own team up. They're also going to try and, taunt the other guys, talk trash. And, those taunting penalties kind of take the fun out of the game in a way. I mean, of course, taunting penalties, there is some room for them in the NFL. If things can get personal, if punches are thrown or whatnot, of course, the refs need to step in and, throw unsportsmanlike conduct flags. But I feel like that's the extent to which that taunting penalties should be, thrown, applied. But, things just like what happened within that Bears and Steelers game from what I was talking about earlier, some of the other taunting penalties, just like looking in the direction of a player or a team's bench, that stuff's just ridiculous to me, honestly. And the refs shouldn't be throwing those flags as often for taunting.
I agree, because some of the best memories that I've had of trash talking, for example, about a decade ago when J.J. Watt was in his prime, and we'd see NFL mic'd up, that clip all over YouTube and everything. It brings back nostalgia, and I'd want to see. Well, it's an emotional game, and players are obviously going to talk on each other in a certain way, but as a fan, you don't want to see the penalties. You want to see what's going to happen. You want to watch the game and see, okay, I understand that they're getting emotional about this, but there's a reason. There's a big Lombardi trophy that you're all playing for, and how could you not get emotional about that? We saw this in the Rams and Bengals game that just transpired with Aaron Donald and several members of the Bengals O-line. I'm not saying that there should be fights. If there's throwing fists and everything, somebody should be ejected. But if there's trash talking, basic trash talking, I don't think it should be called as a flag or a penalty at all.
Oh, I absolutely agree with the taunting and how it needs to be. Definitely heavily restricted to the most egregious examples. I think I have two things here. One, overtime. I think both offenses should get the ball in overtime, regardless if the first team scores a touchdown or not. Kind of similar to college, but I still would like it to be full field, just because if you put it like the 25 or 30 yard line, both teams are going to score touchdowns virtually every time, in my opinion. And onside kicks, I'd like to see them be converted to 4th and 15s, kind of like what they were doing in the Pro Bowl. So one thing I saw in that game that I actually liked because I think with onside kicks, they so rarely are successful that 4th and 15s actually give the offense a shot to keep the ball, but it's still extremely difficult to do. And I think it will just be much more exciting to watch than onside kick. So, kind of the final question to begin wrapping things up here. As we head for this offseason and we start getting ready for the 2022-23 season, what are you anticipating? Like when we reach September, what do you think will be the stuff that we are going to be discussing? What do you think is going to be the most exciting things to watch in the next season?
I think, going back to the storylines that I was talking about, some of the storylines that are going into this season or this upcoming season, will the Rams be able to repeat? Will the Bengals be able to, garner similar success that they had this season? Will the Browns come back? Will the Ravens come back? Will the Jaguars be able to, regain some respect and some high level of play? Which with Trevor Lawrence's second year and Doug Peterson, who won a Super Bowl with the Eagles, being, the bearer that brings that success to Jacksonville. Some other storylines. Will Derrick Henry be the same guy that he was, the past couple years in the league? Just so much, especially with all these new coaches coming in too. I think it was the most hires in quite some time, at least, considering Mike McDaniel coming into Miami. I don't know if he'll be able to unlock something in Tua. A lot of interesting things, as well as Kyler in Arizona and, some of the turmoil there in terms of, his situation, as well as what's going on with Cliff Kingsbury. I know the owner wasn't very happy with his performance down the stretch in the season. A lot of question marks coming into this 2022 regular season.
Might be a little biased, but what about the NFC East? What's going to happen? Because Washington Commanders, another new name for the Washington organization. How are they going to perform? Does Taylor Heineke start again, even if they draft another quarterback, since he has a little bit of a Cinderella story himself? Definitely not something as large as Joe Burrow. Will Jalen Hurts get them to another postseason? Can the Giants even go maybe 8-9? Because this is Daniel Jones' last season to prove himself, I think. I don't think he's been dealt the best hand with all the coordinators changing, but Russell Wilson's definitely more of an appealing name, with Jones having turnover and fumble issues in the past. And the Dallas Cowboys, are they going to continue to struggle in the playoffs even after all the big names they got? Probably the next best defensive player of the decade in Micah Parsons. And are you still going to be amazing in the regular season and choke in the playoffs? Like, I'm very interested in seeing what happens, because I think, in my opinion, it's going to be very competitive next year in the NFC East.
Definitely for me, obviously the Washington Commanders, how did the fans take on to that name? Because obviously, there's a lot of debate when the name came out, but we don't really truly know how that goes over until we see it in action. The Tennessee Titans, when they transferred to the Tennessee Oilers, that first year they go to the Super Bowl, and that name I really think stuck because of that. Yeah, a name is as good as the team on the field. So Washington has a lot of work to do to make that Commanders name stick, but certainly I think a good performance next year will help with that. And obviously, you'll just use quarterbacks, right? Where does Russell Wilson end up? Where does Aaron Rodgers end up? And a name we really haven't discussed that much, Deshaun Watson. Does he make a return? Is he going to be permanently banished? I'm very curious to see what happens with that saga if we get more information on that. Also, the Brian Flores lawsuit. How does that progress? How does that affect the NFL? Does it force Stephen Ross to sell the Dolphins? I mean, there's a report out that the NFL believes that he might have, in fact, try to bribe Flores to lose games. And if that's true, the NFL might force him to sell. So there's a lot of off the field things to really watch for here. But on the field, one team I'm thinking about is the Chargers. The Chargers, with Herbert and Eckler, they have so much talent on the offensive side. But can they rebuild that defense? Can they get the pieces they need to get over the hump, especially in a really difficult division? Because you have the Chiefs, who obviously are going to be as good as long as Mahomes is there. The Raiders, They bring in a new coach, but they still have a lot of talent. The Broncos, if they can get a quarterback, have a ton of talent. That division as a whole is going to be really interesting to see. Also, the Colts, they have a really, really good roster, but their quarterback position is holding them back. What do they do with that? Are they going to go out and get a guy like Jimmy Garoppolo? And can he elevate the Colts? There's so much out there that could sway, because we saw any team can magically turn around from 4-13 this year to the Super Bowl next year. So every team, I think, has some reason for optimism. And we'll see how the next few months plays out. So by the time we reach to training camp and preseason, we'll have a better idea, hopefully, of how these teams are going to perform and how they're going to progress into the next seasons. So I guess it's time now to kind of do our final statements. Just any final thoughts on the season, on the Super Bowl, whatever you want to talk about.
It'll be interesting to see how our teams, talking about some of the things that we're interested in seeing in the 2022 season progress. Will the Titans make a run with Ryan Tannehill? Will the New York Giants improve with Coach Brian Daboll's offensive strategies? And will Daniel Jones prove that he's the guy? Will the Buffalo Bills defense improve quite a bit? Will they bring in those extra pieces in order to go to the Super Bowl, their first Super Bowl since the early 90s with Thurman Thomas and Bruce Smith? Hopefully all of our teams do well, but hopefully the Bills win the Super Bowl, I'll say.
Right. Obviously, when it comes to the Titans, is Ryan Tannehill gonna be the guy? Because I think he probably will be. It takes something drastic for him not to be. But it'll be interesting to see, because if he's the quarterback in September, I feel like there's going to be a tense relationship between him and the fans, because as well as he could do in the regular season, it's all about the playoffs, and he's never played well in the playoffs. So it feels like almost a do or die year for Ryan Tannehill, especially if the Titans make it back to the postseason, which I think they should have a pretty good shot of doing. I mean, it should be them and the Colts again fighting for the AFC South. And the Bills, I think, should be one of the favorites. I think they're the second highest favorite according to Vegas for the Super Bowl. So, and obviously, there's so many teams that it could come down to in the AFC. It's going to be nuts. And NFC might be more wide open though, because will the Rams be the same team? Obviously, I think the Packers are going to fall off. What are the 49ers are going to look like? Who's their quarterback going to be? Is it going to be Trey Lance on day one? It's gonna be fun.
I mean, at least your teams make the playoffs, so it's tough. I'm really looking forward to it. I feel like good things are gonna come to the Giants' way next season.
You gotta remember, 5 years ago, our teams were where your team was. I mean, the Titans and Bills did nothing for years, so we know how it feels for your franchise to suck, but it'll come back around. I think the Giants have a history of success throughout their organization. They have 4 Super Bowls in their career, in their franchise history, which is way more than the Titans or Bills can say. So, I think the Giants they'll come back eventually.
Yeah, and there's also Super Bowls that the Giants have won that we've been alive for, that we've watched. So it's been a little bit of a struggle for the Giants for sure. But I think they're going in the right direction for sure. I trust Joe Shane and Coach Dable to bring back a winning culture to the New York Football Giants. I don't know if Daniel Jones is the guy. Personally, I don't, but I think they'll definitely do better next year, and they'll be able to establish a winning culture within the New York Football Giants organization. And whatever quarterback's there, I think y'all be back in the playoffs sooner than you think.
Yeah, and also one thing to watch too is what quarterback prospects next year really stand out. Because there you go, you got Bryce Young, C.J. Stroud, and there's a whole other group of guys that could get up there too, like a Hendon Hooker, amongst others, who really could be a good guy. Because obviously this year's quarterback draft to me is not great, but next year's really could be special. So that's going to be interesting to see, especially if teams start getting into tank mode. Who are they tanking for? Because a couple years ago they were tanking for Tua, but then Joe Burrow showed up and had an amazing year, and then he was the number 1 draft pick. So And obviously that's not NFL, but as someone who watches college football religiously, I'll be definitely watching that aspect of it just to see, where the future could potentially come from, even beyond next year, because I feel like there's going to be a lot of teams next year that will be looking for a quarterback. Yeah, but for Conor Kennedy and for Leon Taryan, I'm Nicholas Hill. Thank you for watching episode 23 of the Instant Review podcast. We're going to be taking a 5-week break. We'll be back on March 21st as we begin preparing for the NFL draft. So we're going to be, dive into some film here, getting ready for, all the college quarterbacks, halfbacks, and all the other positions, and starting to figure out who these teams are going to take. The Detroit Lions. The Detroit Lions are on the clock as the Jacksonville Jaguars, are on the clock for the number 1 pick. So I'll be very curious to see who they take and who everyone else takes, and how many trades there are going to be, and it's going to be a crazy season. Plus, on March 16th, NFL free agency opens, so we're going to have a lot to talk on that front, and I'm sure there's going to be a ton of moves, a ton of blockbuster news. But make sure to follow us on our socials. I'll probably be doing some at least short reactions on there to potential news that happens, especially on our TikTok at Instant Review Pod. We'll be doing some stuff on there, so definitely come check us out there while we take our little podcast hiatus. But do plan for us to be back on March 21st as we prepare for the NFL draft. Thank you so much. Take care, and thank you so much for following us throughout the 2021-22 season. We look forward to pounding for the offseason and getting ready for 2022 in September for the next season. Take care, y'all.